November 24, 1942. Inside a freezing pocket on the banks of the Volga, over 250,000 German soldiers of the 6th Army await salvation from the sky. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall of the Luftwaffe, has made a promise to Adolf Hitler. His Air Force will deliver 500 tons of supplies every single day to keep the trapped army alive. It was a promise that would prove catastrophic. A promise built on delusion, pride, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what was possible. Over the next 71 days, the Luftwaffe would mount one of the most desperate aerial supply operations in military history and fail spectacularly. This is the story of the Stalingrad Airlift, the broken promise that sealed the fate of Germany's 6th Army and marked a turning point in World War II. The Soviet encirclement. To understand the airlift's failure, one must first understand how the 6th Army found itself trapped in Stalingrad. Throughout the summer and fall of 1942, General Friedrich Paulus's 6th Army had fought its way into the city on the Volga. By November, German forces controlled approximately 90% of Stalingrad's ruins. Victory seemed within reach. But the German flanks were dangerously exposed, protected mainly by weaker Romanian forces. Soviet High Command had been planning. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus was launched, a massive pincer movement striking at the vulnerable Romanian 3rd Army north of Stalingrad and the Romanian 4th Army to the south. Within 4 days, the Soviet pincers met. The trap had snapped shut. Inside the pocket, approximately 250,000 German and Axis troops, along with 10,000 civilians and several thousand Soviet prisoners of war. The last supply train had reached the army on November 22nd. Now, with winter descending and Soviet forces tightening the noose, the question facing German High Command was stark: break out or hold position. Any competent military assessment would have recommended immediate breakout. The encirclement was still relatively weak. Supplies existed. Escape was possible. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was already organizing a relief operation to punch through the Soviet lines. But Hitler issued the order that would doom the 6th Army. Stand fast, no retreat. The army would be supplied by air until it could be relieved. It was a promise that required the impossible. And Hermann Göring promised he could deliver it. The fatal calculation. The mathematics of the Stalingrad Airlift were brutal from the beginning. To maintain combat effectiveness, the 6th Army required approximately 500 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and winter clothing. To survive at minimum capacity, the Army needed at least 300 tons per day. The primary aircraft available was the Junkers U-52, the workhorse of German transport aviation. Each U-52 could carry approximately 2 tons of supplies per sortie. To deliver 300 tons daily would require at least 150 successful flights. To deliver Göring's promised 500 tons would require 250 flights every single day. This was the calculation presented to Hitler on November 24th by Chief of Staff Kurt Zeitzler. Zeitzler was skeptical. He pointed out the weather conditions, the limited number of aircraft, the distance to be covered, and the expected losses to Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Accounting for non-flying days due to weather, The Luftwaffe would need to deliver closer to 750 tons on good flying days to maintain the required average. But when Göring arrived and heard the requirements, he confidently assured Hitler it could be done. The Reichsmarschall pointed to the Demyansk airlift operation of the previous winter, where the Luftwaffe had successfully supplied encircled forces by air. Zeitzler erupted. He called Göring's prowess a lie. The comparison to Demyansk was absurd. The Demyansk pocket contained fewer than half the troops now trapped in Stalingrad. The Demyansk operation had faced virtually no Soviet air opposition. The distances had been shorter, the weather had been less severe, and crucially, Germany had possessed more aircraft in 1941 than it did in late 1942. But Hitler had already committed. He had radioed Paulus to hold position, promising that the Luftwaffe would keep the army supplied. To reverse the decision now would be an admission of fallibility, something Hitler's psychology could not permit. Moreover, Göring was the second most powerful man in the Reich. To publicly contradict him would undermine the entire Nazi hierarchy. The airlift would proceed. The Sixth Army would not attempt breakout, and 250,000 men would stake their lives on Göring's promise. Assembling the fleet. The Luftwaffe went to extraordinary lengths to assemble sufficient aircraft for the operation. In November 1942, the Luftwaffe possessed approximately 750 Junkers U-52 transport aircraft spread across all theaters. 1/3 were committed to operations in Tunisia. The training establishment was stripped of aircraft and instructor pilots. Provisional units were formed from training squadrons across the Reich. Some U-52s were pulled for Mediterranean operations, despite desperate needs there. But transport aircraft alone would not be enough. The Luftwaffe began converting bombers into cargo carriers. Henkel HE-111 bombers were modified to carry supplies in external containers mounted on their bomb racks, approximately 1 ton per aircraft. These makeshift transports were slower and less efficient than purpose-built cargo planes, but desperation demanded improvisation. Additional aircraft types were pressed into service. Junkers U-86 bombers, Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor long-range aircraft, even experiments with freight gliders. By early December, the Germans had assembled a diverse and unwieldy fleet of several hundred aircraft dedicated to the airlift. The main operating base became Tatsinska Airfield, located 260 kilometers west of Stalingrad. From Tatsinska, a U-52 required approximately 75 minutes to reach the pocket. With a turnaround time of about 3.5 hours, theoretically, each aircraft could complete 1 mission per day, perhaps 2 in optimal conditions. A secondary base at Morozovska handled the converted HE-111 bombers. Inside the pocket, 7 airfields were designated to receive supplies, with Pitomnik Airfield serving as the primary receiving point. On paper, the Germans had assembled sufficient resources. The aircraft existed. The airfields were operational. The supply stocks were available. But between theory and execution lay a chasm that would prove unbridgeable. Reality strikes. The airlift began on November 24, 1942. Within days, the gulf between Göring's promises and operational reality became brutally apparent. On the first full day of operations, only 22 of 47 Junker 52s dispatched managed to land in the pocket. The next day brought 30 successful deliveries. After 5 days, only 60 tons had been delivered. less than 4% of the 1,750 tons that should have arrived if the operation were meeting its targets. The obstacles were overwhelming. First, the weather. December 1942 brought some of the worst winter conditions in years. Blizzards swept across the steppes, temperatures plummeted, visibility dropped to zero. On December 9th, over 150 aircraft were dispatched, but not a single one could deliver its cargo due to a massive snowstorm. There were entire days when no flights could operate at all. When the Soviet forces captured Tatsinskaya airfield during their advance, the Luftwaffe hastily evacuated the remaining aircraft, but lost approximately 70 Junkers, nearly 40% of the transport fleet stationed there. The airlift was forced to relocate to more distant airfields, adding hours to each mission and further reducing delivery capacity. Second, aircraft maintenance and serviceability. The daily operational rate for transport aircraft averaged only 33 to 40%. For every 100 aircraft nominally available, only 30 to 40 were actually flyable on any given day. Cold weather froze engines, maintenance facilities were overwhelmed, spare parts were scarce, crews were exhausted. When the Soviets overran forward airfields, they captured not just aircraft, but crucial ground equipment, snowplows, engine heaters, maintenance tools. The Germans had retreated so quickly they hadn't had time to evacuate essential support equipment. Third, and most critically, the Soviet Air Force. Unlike at Demyansk, the Red Air Force was present in strength over Stalingrad. Soviet fighters, Yak-1s, LAG-3s, and increasingly capable American-supplied P-39 Airacobras hunted the lumbering German transports. The slow, poorly armed Junker 52s and converted bombers were easy prey. On December 4th, the Soviet Air Force commander Novikov established an organized air blockade system, coordinating fighter patrols to systematically intercept German supply flights. The VVS flew hundreds of sorties daily, turning the air corridor to Stalingrad into a gauntlet of fire. The death spiral. As December turned to January, the airlift entered a death spiral from which it would never recover. The best single day of the entire operation came on December 7th, when 135 transport aircraft landed at Pitomnik Airfield, delivering 362 tons of supplies. It was the only time the airlift came anywhere close to meeting minimum requirements. Weather prevented any flights at all on December 3rd and 9th. Inside the pocket, the 6th Army was dying. Rations were cut. Soldiers were allocated 100 grams of bread per day, less than a slice. Horses were slaughtered for meat, then rats. Men starved while manning their positions. Frostbite claimed more casualties than combat. Medical supplies ran out. The wounded died for lack of basic treatment. The airfields inside the pocket deteriorated. Soviet artillery pounded Pitomnik relentlessly. Aircraft landing under fire were frequently destroyed on the ground before they could be unloaded. Maintenance crews worked desperately to keep the landing strips clear of snow and debris, but conditions worsened daily. And the supplies that did arrive were often bizarrely inappropriate. In one infamous incident, aircraft dropped women's mink fur coats instead of winter uniforms. Tons of spices arrived while soldiers starved. Packages of military decorations and badges were delivered instead of ammunition. The disconnect between rear area supply officers and the desperate reality inside the pocket was absolute. By mid-January, Pitomnik Airfield was overrun by Soviet forces. The airlift shifted to Gumrak Airfield, even closer to the collapsing front lines. On January 25th, the pocket split in two, cutting Gumrak off from the southern sector. On February 2nd, 1943, the remnants of the 6th Army surrendered. The last supply drop,
delivered over the tractor factory district, arrived on February 3rd. The men it was meant to save were already dead or in captivity. The Reckoning. The final accounting of the Stalingrad Airlift tells a story of catastrophic failure. Over 71 days of operations, 4,487 transport sorties were flown into the pocket. Total supplies delivered, 8,350 tons. Average daily delivery, 117 tons, less than 1/4 of the minimum requirement and less than 1/4 of what Göring had promised. The supplies that did arrive broke down to approximately 600 tons of fuel, 1,122 tons of ammunition, 2,020 tons of rations, and 129 tons of miscellaneous supplies. For an army of 250,000 men fighting in winter conditions, it was grotesquely inadequate. The human cost inside the pocket was staggering. Of approximately 300,000 Axis troops trapped in Stalingrad, roughly 90,000 survived to enter Soviet captivity in early February. Only about 6,000 of those prisoners would ever return to Germany. The rest died from starvation, disease, combat, and the brutal conditions of Soviet prison camps. The Luftwaffe's losses were equally devastating. Official tallies recorded 488 aircraft destroyed or written off, 274 destroyed outright or missing, and 214 damaged beyond repair. But individual unit reports suggest actual losses were significantly higher. More critically, approximately 1,000 of the Luftwaffe's finest pilots, aircrew, and flight instructors were killed or captured. The training establishment had been stripped to provide crews for the airlift. When those crews were lost, the training pipeline collapsed. The Luftwaffe would never fully recover. Entire training programs came to a standstill during the winter of 1942-43. By spring, the airlift had consumed 240 training crews and 365 training aircraft. The impact rippled through 1943 and 1944 as the quality of new Luftwaffe pilots declined precipitously. The experienced instructors lost at Stalingrad could never be replaced. Why it failed. The Stalingrad airlift failed not because of the men who flew the missions, but because of the leaders who ordered them. Hermann Göring's promise was built on ego, delusion, and a fundamental disconnect from operational reality. By 1942, Göring had become more interested in looting art from occupied territories than understanding the capabilities and limitations of his air force. He made a promise to Hitler without consulting his frontline commanders, without analyzing the logistics, without considering the Soviet opposition. When experienced Luftwaffe officers, men like Wolfram von Richthofen and Martin Fiebig, who commanded the actual airlift operations, tried to explain that the mission was impossible, they were overruled. Their professional assessments were dismissed. Göring had given his word to the Führer, and the operation would proceed regardless of reality. Hitler's decision to forbid the Sixth Army's breakout was equally catastrophic. Had Paulus been allowed to fight his way out when the encirclement was still weak, much of the army could have been saved. But Hitler's obsession with not yielding territory, his mystical belief in standing fast, and his confidence in Göring's promises condemned an entire army to destruction. The airlift also revealed the limits of German logistics and organizational flexibility. The Luftwaffe was fundamentally structured for short, intensive campaigns, blitzkrieg operations, where air superiority was assumed and distances were manageable. Extended large-scale area logistics operations under contested airspace were beyond its doctrinal and organizational capabilities. Finally, The airlift demonstrated that air supply cannot substitute for sound operational planning. No amount of aerial logistics could compensate for the fundamental strategic error of allowing the Sixth Army to be encircled in the first place. The failure of the Stalingrad Airlift became one of the defining disasters of World War II. It demonstrated to the world that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, that German promises were hollow, and that the Nazi leadership was willing to sacrifice entire armies to avoid admitting error. For the German public, Stalingrad was more than a military defeat, it was a betrayal. An entire army had been abandoned, left to starve and freeze, while Göring assured them salvation was coming. The myth of German military superiority shattered in the frozen ruins on the Volga. The lessons of Stalingrad would echo through the remainder of the war. Never again would the Luftwaffe attempt an airlift operation of this scale. Never again would Hitler trust Göring's assurances. And never again would German soldiers believe the promise that they could be supplied from the air if they simply held their ground. The Stalingrad Airlift stands as a monument to the consequences of pride, delusion, and the refusal to accept military reality. It was a broken promise that cost 300,000 lives and marked the beginning of Germany's inevitable defeat on the Eastern Front.